Good evening. My name is Ray Jonas. I guess you imagine by now, and it's my great pleasure tonight, on behalf of my colleagues in the Department of History at the University of Washington, to welcome you here. Tonight we offer the third in our four-lecture series on the Great War and the modern world, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to welcome in particular those of you in the main room here on the main floor, also those in the balcony, and those in an adjacent room who are watching us on live video feed. I also want to welcome those who will be watching on a subsequent broadcast on UwTV. We're very pleased to be able to share with you this sold-out lecture series. By the way, if you missed last week's lecture by Devin Narr, it will be broadcast tomorrow night, I believe at 8 p.m., but check your schedules for place and time. And of course, all of the lectures will be available eventually on live streaming on YouTube. We are also live tweeting tonight. Probably wondering what that means, but we are live tweeting tonight, and you can follow along at the hashtag Great War. Let me remind you about the format for our evening. Tonight's lecture will take about 60 minutes. It will be followed immediately by questions, the questions from you, from the audience, for about 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes. There will be no intermission. So we'll go directly from the lecture to the Q&A portion of the evening. For those of you in the main lecture hall, when you arrived this evening, you were offered a note card. If you'd like to ask a question of tonight's speaker, jot your question down on the note card, and toward the end of our lecture, pass it along down the row to the aisle where we'll be collecting and passing them forward for our speaker. We'll collect and we'll share as many as possible in the time that we have available. Now, please take a moment to make sure that your early 21st century technology is turned off so as not to disturb the mood of our early 20th century evening. Tonight's speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce, is Jordanna Bailkin. She holds the Giovanni and Amne Costigan Endowed Professorship in the Department of History at the University of Washington. In a mere 15 years since she earned her PhD at Stanford University, she's already accumulated a distinguished scholarly record. She's published 2 books, the most recent of which, The Afterlife of Empire, has won no fewer than 3 book prizes. Other publications show an extraordinary range, both methodological and geographical. And they also show a keen interest in the aesthetic dimension of the past. Her current research concerns refugee and resettlement camps in Britain between 1930 and the 1980s. Tonight, her theme is home fronts and battlefronts. Let's welcome her to the stage.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for the third lecture in our series on the Great War and the modern world. We've seen already in 2 wonderful lectures by Professors Ray Jonas and Devin Narr how we can think of this war, the Great War, as being both very far away from us here in Seattle, but also very close. What I want to do this evening is explore further this idea of distance and closeness in the Great War, and more particularly the idea of home fronts and battlefronts in my own research area of Britain. This is terminology that comes from the Great War itself. The vocabulary of the home front is really invented during the Great War. And I want to think tonight about what we should do with that vocabulary 100 years on. Is this really a useful way and a productive way to understand this particular war? So I want to sketch out how this idea emerged. The idea that there was an uncrossable gulf and an absolute break between the home front and the battlefront. And that those who had not experienced the trenches had not fully experienced the war. This is a common motif, both during the war and even more so after it. That is, the inability of the soldier to articulate his experience and the inability of the civilian to understand that experience. Here we see a quote from a young British soldier who has been in the trenches and has come back to England on leave. "It is very nice to be home again," he says. "Yet am I at home? One sometimes doubts it. There are occasions when I feel like a visitor amongst strangers whose intentions are kindly, but whose modes of thought I neither altogether understand nor altogether approve." That sense of isolation and alienation that this soldier is expressing is incredibly common. In some ways, this perceived split between civilian and soldier, this is what really comes to define 20th century warfare. What we see during the Great War is an interesting contradiction. And that is that the more important civilians become in military terms, and the more important a role that civilians play in actually winning the war, and the more that civilians suffer in the war, the deeper the rift becomes between civilians and soldiers in public perception. So that is part of the contradiction to explore here. The term civilian goes back to medieval times, but it used to mean something quite different. So a civilian in medieval terminology was someone who practiced civil law as opposed to common law or canon law. As the British expanded their empire, the term civilian changed. So in the 18th century and the 19th century, when British writers talk about civilians, they mean any Briton in India who is not a soldier, businessmen, merchants, and politicians. So our own usage of that term, that a civilian is a non-combatant during wartime. A civilian is a protected category of person who lives apart from the war. That is a usage that becomes much more popular during the Great War itself. This is very effective vocabulary as propaganda. That is, soldiers are fighting to protect these people called civilians, and civilians are passive subjects who need the soldiers' protection. This is a motif that's used to sell the war. But what I want to suggest tonight is that this is a very limited concept historically. So I want to acknowledge first the power of this idea of the home front versus the battlefront. This is a concept with great impact, and it's a concept that's had great longevity. So we need to understand how it came about. But I also want to try to look beneath that image and beyond it, and think about how the home front and the battlefront were perhaps not so separate as they seemed. What do we miss when we reduce this war to home fronts and battlefronts? And whose experiences are misunderstood or invisible or lost? So let me start out with what has seemed to be the defining experience of 1914, trench warfare. Why do British soldiers feel so powerfully that this experience has changed them forever? And that their experience is the only true experience of the war? If we look at Britain before conscription, so from August of 1914 to January of 1916, more than 2 million British men volunteered to serve. And just to zero in on that chronology a little bit more, 113,000 men volunteered just between August 4th and August 24th of 1914. So just in the first 3 weeks of the war, 113,000 British men. But the even bigger recruitment came in the first week of September, when nearly 200,000 men volunteered in just 7 days. Now that timing is interesting because it means that people are not just signing up in an initial burst of enthusiasm. This is not an unthinking or a naive idealism. But this is when bad news is starting to trickle in about the battles in France and Belgium. That is when we see the biggest rush of British volunteers. There were so many volunteers, as we see in this photograph, that recruiting stations could not cope with them. So recruits often arrived at training camps to find there were no more uniforms for them to wear, and they would have to drill with broom handles instead of with guns. There is a tremendous urgency about these early British volunteers because they believe the war will be over in months, or perhaps even in weeks. They don't want to miss the war, and that's one reason that they sign up so quickly. This poster comes out in September of 1914, so it comes out very early in the war. And it is everywhere. This is Herbert Kitchener, Britain's Secretary of State for War. And one British private, a man named Thomas Mackindoe, said this was the poster that made him enlist. He said it was seeing the picture of Kitchener and his finger pointing at you. Any position that you took up, the finger was always pointing at you. Now, in truth, most of the men who signed up in September did not see this poster. It was printed after that rush of volunteers that I talked about. But still, I think we can see for an individual like Thomas Mackindoe, he felt very personally connected to and very personally moved by this image. And it was part of what turned him into a volunteer. Kitchener very much wanted a volunteer army. He said he preferred men who knew nothing to men who knew a smattering of the wrong things. So he really thought of an untrained volunteer army as being a strength for the British rather than a weakness. He did not think it would be possible to get through the whole war just with volunteers, but he really saw this moment where Britain could rely on volunteers as a very positive thing. The British Army at this moment is incredibly easy to join. It's not so easy to leave, but it's incredibly easy to join. So volunteers are supposed to be 18 in order to sign up. They are supposed to be 19 in order to fight overseas. But in truth, no one is checking their age at all. So there are stories of young boys coming into recruiting officers and admitting that they are 17 or 16 or even 15. And the recruiting officer saying to them, go outside and come back in and tell me something else. And that is why we have what I think is an absolutely shocking statistic, that at least 250,000 British soldiers were actually underage. 250,000 were underage. In fact, the very first British casualty of the Great War, Private John Parr, was just barely 17 when he died. There are no pictures of John Parr that exist, so I don't have a picture of him. This is a photo of his grave in France. John Parr was killed just 17 days into the Great War. He was a reconnaissance cyclist, so he was a soldier who rode on ahead of his regiment to gather information about enemy troops. And his death is very mysterious. No one knows exactly the circumstances under which he was killed, but most historians think that he was sent out to find a missing unit. He was killed by a rifle shot, but the consensus now is that he was probably killed by friendly fire. His mother wrote to the War Office for months to find out where he was, but his death was not actually confirmed until after the war was over, so she didn't know where her son was or whether he was alive for the whole duration of the war. So the first British soldier who died in the Great War was actually below the legal age to fight. Now, if you look at his gravestone, the age given there was age 20. So the gravestone is kind of keeping up this fiction that all of Britain's soldiers were of age, even though we know so many of them were not. So the age requirement was not systematically enforced. There were other requirements. There were physical requirements. So for example, volunteers had to be taller than 5'3". They have to be able to expand their chest to 34 inches. And they have to be able to see beyond their nose. So these are pretty minimal physical requirements, though we'll see not everyone is able to meet them. This is another British recruitment poster. And all of these posters, by the way, were produced by the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee, which is part of the War Office. And that committee put out more than 54 million copies of around 200 posters during the war. This one in particular is called "Which Ought You to Wear?" And it really plays on this truism that in British society, a man's hat tells you who he is in social terms and in economic terms. So you can really tell where a man is on the social scale by the type of hat that he wears. What this poster is suggesting is that those old divisions of class don't matter anymore. Class divisions will be swept away by service to the war. So it doesn't matter if you used to wear the upper class top hat or the working class bowler hat. Now all good British men are going to wear the soldier's cap. And that new identity, that identity of being a soldier, is going to replace all of the old class identities that used to exist. There's a similar idea with this poster, "Step into your place." The idea here is that men from all different professions will be united in the military. So whether they wore the judge's wig or the postman's cap, now they will all be turned into soldiers in khaki, and they will be marching with the same gun and wearing the same uniform. So whatever kind of work you did in the past, now your real place is here, in the war effort. The message is that the military transcends class, and the military has a place for everyone. Well, these are recruitment posters. They are aimed at motivating people to enlist. And they are offering a bit of a fantasy. Because the truth is that the British forces were not a cross-section of society. And they do not represent every social class equally. The higher up the social scale that a man was, the greater the chance that he would serve early in the war, the greater the chance that he would serve in a combat unit, and the greater the chance that he would serve as an officer. Even with those very lax physical requirements that I mentioned, 1 out of every 3 British volunteers was deemed physically unfit to serve. And most of the unfit men are industrial workers because they have a poorer diet than middle class and upper class men. And they also tended to have less access to medical care. So in 1914, even though those industrial volunteers are trying to volunteer, those industrial workers, they are often not let in, and especially not into the officer class. What this winds up meaning is that higher social status carries higher risks of casualty. The officers suffered higher casualty rates than the men in the ranks, partly because of their own expectations that gentlemen should lead the ranks to set an example. And these officers come mostly from the upper echelons of British society. This is why we hear so much of a lost generation in Britain, because it wasn't just the sheer numbers killed, it was the social distribution of those numbers. This is a war in which educated men play an incredibly significant role. So of the men from Oxford who served in the Great War, if we look at the graduating class of 1914, 29% of those men died. This is double the death rate for the average soldier. So there's a point to stress here that I think really bears thinking about and dwelling on in 2014. And that is that in 1914, the young elites of Britain and the sons of the most powerful men in Britain went to war not only willingly, but lightheartedly. That will never happen again. So what do these men find? The first major campaign is the Battle of the Marne in northeast France. And this is where the Great War really begins to take shape, and in particular where trench warfare takes on its shape. On August 4th of 1914, Germany crosses the Belgian frontier, and the German troops start sweeping towards Paris. Germany is trying for one knockout blow against France. The German idea is that they are going to have to fight their enemies separately. So they are going to have to fight the French and the Russians separately. And since the Germans know that the Russian army is a very large army, but it is a very sluggish army, the Germans decide they will go west and deal with the French first. And hopefully by the time they take out the French, they can wheel back around to the east to deal with Russia. So the Germans leave just about an eighth of their forces behind. They leave them behind for home defense. And the other 7/8 of their forces they send west. The French armies go east because they are trying to take back the territories they lost in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. So they want to reclaim the territories of Alsace and Lorraine from Germany. So the French are fighting an old battle here. They are fighting a 19th century battle. And they go off to the Marne. They go off wearing their bright red and blue tunics, their wool tunics. They go off wearing their immaculate white gloves. And they are mowed down by German machine gun fire. So the first French divisions are completely destroyed. This is one of many new things about this war. Less than 1% of the casualties in the Great War are caused by bayonets or sabers. So these weapons that you have to use up close to someone. Only 1% of the casualties are caused by bayonets and sabers. The vast majority of the casualties, the vast majority of people who are killed in this war are killed by people who they cannot see and who never see them. So these first French divisions have been destroyed by German machine guns. And the British and the French launch a counterattack on the Germans from September 6th to September 10th. And this is the Battle of the Marne. Somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 French soldiers are rushed to the battlefront in taxicabs because it is all unfolding so quickly. Now, a real mythology sprang up around these taxicabs and what they were supposed to indicate about the cooperative relationship between French soldiers and French civilians. That is, that ordinary civilians, ordinary taxi drivers, were heroically shuttling men to the battlefield. In truth, 6,000 soldiers was not particularly meaningful in military terms. So this is not something that actually changes the course of the battle or the outcome of the battle. What it does show, I think, is how anxious the French state was to mythologize any kind of cooperation between soldiers and civilians. and try to publicize any example of that cooperation that they could find. The two armies, the Germans on the one side and the French and the British on the other side, try to outflank each other. And they keep pushing west and north until they reach the coast. So by the middle of October of 1914, we have a line of combat that goes from the Belgian North Sea to the borders of Switzerland. And this line is called the Western Front. It is a front that stretches over 475 miles. And here the armies stay dug in a stalemate for the rest of the war. There is virtually no movement on the Western Front at all. So these two sides are locked in a tactical immobility. This is a shattering revelation that emerges from the Battle of the Marne. It's a revelation that the war will be long and expensive and deadly. This is not going to be the war that was expected. The Germans have only enough shells at the front to last them for 4 days, which I think really tells you something about their expectations. So the British and the French on one side and the Germans on the other, they all build their trenches at the Battle of the Marne. Ultimately, they are going to build 25,000 miles of trenches. That's enough for a trench to circle the earth. Now, the different nations had different kinds of trenches. So the German trenches were really technological masterpieces. The German trenches had running water often. They had electric lighting. Sometimes they had staircases. So these could be very elaborate spaces, the German trenches. They could even be comfortable spaces. They had furniture. They had wallpaper, even sometimes. They had doorbells, and some of them had telephones. The Germans built on significantly higher ground, which meant that the British had to build exactly where the annual rainfall was greatest and where the water table was highest. So almost as soon as the British would start to dig their trenches, they would almost always find water just 2 or 3 feet beneath the surface. So the British trenches were constantly collapsing. And this is why many British soldiers thought of mud as being their worst enemy. Many soldiers wrote about mud being worse than the Germans. And it was not uncommon for soldiers to drown in the mud. This is a French soldier speaking, but I think his experience is typical of many trench experiences on the Allied side. He says, "Trenches are no more than cesspools filled with a mixture of water and urine. The sides cave in behind you as you pass with a soft slither. We ourselves are transformed into statues of clay with mud even in one's very mouth." Now, the official policy is that men should not spend more than 1 week in the trenches. In practice, it is not atypical for men to spend 2 or 3 weeks in the trenches without a break. And there was a Scottish battalion in Flanders that spent 38 days in the trenches with no break. Both sides tried to take this incredibly alien, unprecedented experience and try to make it seem familiar. So they would name the trenches after streets in London or after their favorite brands of beer. But life in the trenches really was a new human event. It was one of constant exhaustion, lice, pneumonia, frostbite, and rats feeding on corpses. The trench generated its own pathologies, not only battle wounds and shell shock, but constant rat bites and also the dreaded trench foot. 20,000 cases of trench foot just in the winter of 1914. These are places where the living had to stand side by side with the dead. The living have to continue to fight next to the dead. So the trenches are active battle sites, but also at the same time, they are graveyards and cemeteries. Now, between the two lines of trenches was no man's land, this chaotic, burned-out landscape. It's made of shell craters, abandoned corpses, and more mud. No man's land is one of the most recurrent images of the Great War. It captures the sense of having been sent beyond the boundaries of the known, sent beyond the boundaries of the socially acceptable, and being sent into the realm of the inconceivable. The phrase over the top, to say that something is so outlandish, it's just over the top, comes from trench warfare. So that is how you describe the process of climbing out of the trenches to go onto the offensive in no man's land. This is a poem by the British poet Siegfried Sassoon. He was a Briton who fought himself in the trenches, and he is talking about this process of going over the top. Clumsily bowed with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear, men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of gray, fluttering faces masked with fear. They leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh, Jesus, make it stop. Now, I think we can see for Sassoon, life in the trench takes place out of time. It takes place out of kilter with civilian life. So Sassoon is really reinforcing the sense that trench soldiers are having an unprecedented experience. They are having an experience that separates them from everyone else. This is very powerful imagery that Sassoon gives us. But what I want to look at now is trying to get beneath that image and seeing how the trench is perhaps not so far from the home front as one might think. I mean that quite literally, because it is hard to grasp how physically close the battlefront and the home front really were. So if you lived in Surrey or Sussex or Kent, these rural counties in southeast England, you could literally hear the war. You can hear the shelling on the Western Front. So geographically, there's not much of a divide, and those boundaries are very porous. There are also incredible postal communications between England and the trenches on the Western Front. So you can get the London newspapers in the trenches just a day late. And letters and packages can go back and forth in 2 or 3 days. I talked about the rush of volunteers in the autumn of 1914. This meant that by the winter, there were not enough barracks to house those soldiers. So 800,000 soldiers were billeted with British civilians. And that means that rather than civilians being separated from soldiers, they are in fact coming into much more intimate contact with them in civilian homes. The home front itself is not static. The home front is constantly changing, and it is changing to meet the demands of the war. So even as early as September of 1914, England looks and sounds very different than it did just a few weeks before. London is more or less blacked out at night. Big Ben has been silenced by October. The public spaces are covered with recruiting posters. We hear the accents of French refugees and Belgian refugees everywhere. And also we can see the sight of wounded soldiers. These are the first wounded soldiers arriving in England in September of 1914. And you can see, rather than being isolated, a huge crowd has gathered to witness the arrival of these soldiers. So this is all becoming part of everyday life in England. This is becoming part of the sensory experience of being in England. Even the trench, the ultimate symbol of the battlefront. There are trenches in England as well. They're built for practice, but they're also built for home defense, because in 1914, a German invasion seemed like a very real threat. So the trench in this photograph is not on the Western Front. This is a trench in Kent, in southeast England. So the look and the feel of the home front is changing. There are also new realms and new forms of surveillance and intervention in civilian life in England. The Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA, was passed on August 8th of 1914. It is passed to secure the public safety, and it is passed with no parliamentary debate whatsoever. It is barely more than a paragraph, and it is intentionally vague. It says no one can do anything to impede the war effort. Now, what does this actually mean? Some of the Act's restrictions are relatively minor, and some of them are even kind of funny. So, for example, it becomes illegal to whistle for a taxi cab in London because the whistle sounds too much like an air raid siren. Also, pub hours are restricted, and it becomes illegal to buy your friend a drink. It becomes illegal to buy a round for other people in a pub because the concern is that too much drinking might slow down production on the home front. This is also the moment that daylight saving time is introduced in Britain, with the aim, again, of increasing productivity on the home front. But there are much more sinister elements and more intrusive elements of the Defense of the Realm Act. For example, information can be censored. So any information that is said to be likely to cause disaffection or alarm can be censored. Civilians can have their homes searched, and they can have their documents seized without a warrant. And civilians who violate the Defense of the Realm Act can not only be arrested, but they can be tried by court-martial. So this is one example of how British civilians are being treated like soldiers. Another example is the Munitions of War Act, which was passed in July of 1915. And what this act does is it authorizes the British state to control the flow of labor. So the British state, under this act, can take all British metal workers and direct them into the munitions factories. And the state can control the mobility of these workers for the whole duration of the war. So what this means, essentially, is that civilian metal workers are being drafted into the war. They are drafted into making munitions. And they cannot leave. They cannot change jobs without a special certificate called a leaving certificate. I think this act raises the question of whether there is really any such thing as a civilian in the Great War. What we see in the Munitions of War Act is that people who are supposed to be civilians are actually treated as soldiers by the state. Now, initially, this act is only supposed to apply to metal workers, but then it expands. It expands to include all other kinds of skilled labor. So anything that seems like it might be useful for the war effort. That means that ultimately, under the Munitions of War Act, skilled workers in Britain cannot change jobs without permission during the Great War. They cannot choose where they work anymore. And if a worker breaks this rule, then he or she is banned from working anywhere for 6 weeks. Now, this would be impossible for most British workers. Most British workers could not survive for 6 weeks without pay. This act affects around 2 million people, 30% of the industrial workforce in Britain. What we're seeing in the Great War is a militarization of civilians and an erosion of their civil liberties. Now, at the same time, most of the soldiers of the Great War were not professional soldiers. They were basically civilians in uniform. So while the civilians are treated like soldiers, the soldiers are very recent civilians. It's interesting that we don't really think of the Great War when we think of attacks on civilians. It's the Second World War that we think of as the People's War. That's the War of the Blitz. That's the civilian war. But in fact, almost as soon as the fighting starts in 1914, there are civilian targets in Britain. In December of 1914, German cruisers bomb civilians on the British coast. And there is a terrifying attack on Scarborough, on Hartlepool, and on Whitby. This particular photograph is the naval recruiting station at Scarborough. And I want to read you a description of this attack from one of the surviving residents of Scarborough. Boom, boom, bang, swish. Cannon after cannon and shells sounded. You can't imagine what it was like. It sounded like terrible thunder, but incessant and 1,000 times worse. Everyone was in a panic. I was all shaking. People were off their heads. Some passing through here said Scarborough is in flames. Others said the Germans had landed. We were afraid. Now, many people thought this bombardment in December was the beginning of a German invasion. And there was a mass exodus from all 3 of those towns. The local newspaper said the war is getting nearer to us. 228 civilians were wounded in this attack, and 78 more were killed. For the 78 people who were killed, their funerals were media events. They were very highly publicized, and they were attended by big crowds. They also became rallying points for recruitment. What will British men do to redeem these civilian deaths? And we can see here new recruitment posters that are appealing to men to try to avenge the women and the children of Scarborough. It is really the air war that turns the home front into a combat zone. This is Martha Taylor and Samuel Smith. He was a shoemaker, and she was known only as a spinster. And when German Zeppelins raided the east coast of Britain, Martha and Samuel became famous for an unhappy reason. They are the first British civilians to be killed in an attack from the air. This is in January of 1915. These attacks from the air will accelerate in 1917. The most shocking episode took place on June 13th, 1917, just around noon. A stray bomb from a German plane hit the North Street School in Poplar in East London. So a 110-pound bomb crashed right through the 3 stories of the school. 30 children were wounded, and 18 children were killed. For the ones who were killed, there was a mass funeral held for them. Most of the victims were under 6 years old. And the British press describe the deaths at the Poplar Street School not as war deaths, but as murders. This is one of the survivors of the Poplar bombing, Rose Morehouse, and she is talking about her memories of that day when the school was bombed. We didn't hear anything, no noise, no bomb falling. Next thing I remember was that I felt heavy. I could scarcely breathe. I couldn't speak, and I couldn't move. I had bits of debris in my mouth. Things come into your mind, and all I wanted was my mom. Again, these attacks are used as recruiting tools. So men are told it would be better to face the bullets in the trenches than to be killed in your own house by a bomb. I think what we see in a poster like this is that the boundary between the home front and the battlefront is blurring. Every British home is potentially under fire. This is a letter from a soldier named Jack Mudd, a British soldier. And it's a letter that he sent to his wife in October of 1917. It's a very tragic letter because Jack Mudd actually went missing in action just a few days after he sent this letter. So he's writing to his wife, and he says, "I guess you have been worried with the air raids. You know, dear, it's hard to be out here fighting, and yet your wife and children can't be safe. Still, dearest, don't worry. You have a 20,000 to 1 chance, and God will watch over you as he has been with me ever since I have been out here." I think this is so interesting to see what Jack Mudd is scared of. What is Jack Mudd worried about? It's not his own safety in the trenches, but it's the safety of his family at home in Britain. The air raids of the Great War killed 1,239 Britons and injured nearly 3,000 more. Now, those numbers are going to be totally eclipsed in the Second World War. That's when civilian deaths will skyrocket. So the numbers aren't so large here. But what they show is that civilians are having their own war. The home front is in many ways just a series of little battlefronts. Now, part of what Mudd's letter is about, of course, is relationships between men and women, and the way those relationships were being changed by the war. Mudd is worried about the dangers that his wife faces at home, but I think he's still making a fundamental assumption here. And that is that the home front is the world of women, and the battlefront is the world of men. This is such a strong presumption that many writers talk about Britain in 1914 as being empty of men or denuded of men. What that perception overlooks is a vast number of male non-combatants. For example, Britain has between 16 and 20,000 conscientious objectors, who are known pejoratively as conchies. Now, the law in England does not define conscientious objection very clearly, but it's supposed to include people whose objection genuinely rests on religious conviction or moral conviction. So anyone who wants to claim conscientious objector status has to go in front of a local tribunal that will decide their fate. So that means people who might know you personally, usually people who would be prominent members of your community, will weigh in on whether they think your claim is genuine or not. Now, if your claim is rejected by that tribunal, you were immediately treated as a soldier who was absent without leave, so you could be subject to arrest. Some of the tribunal leaders are opposed to the whole idea of conscientious objection. And they really use this forum of the tribunal to publicize their views and try to ridicule the conscientious objectors. So one objector who was 18, who went before a tribunal, he was told that he was too young to have a conscience. And his case was dismissed on the spot, and he was immediately sent to prison. Now, if we look at this group, obviously this is a large group of conscientious objectors, and they have quite diverse motives. Some of them are Quakers. Some of them are Christian fundamentalists who take literally the biblical injunction, thou shalt not kill. Others are political activists on the left, for example, socialists, and they tend to see the Great War as an imperialist war, a war that is dividing workers around the world from one another, workers who should be united. Those leftist activists are not necessarily pacifists. They're not necessarily against all forms of war. So they might be willing to fight in a different war, but they are not willing to fight in this one. There are also people who are opposed to killing, but not necessarily on religious grounds. So people who might be described as secular humanists. So the conscientious objectors have a range of different motives. They also have a range of different experiences during the war itself. So some actually served in the military, but refused to bear arms. Some did other kinds of work in Britain, work that was called of national importance. So that's what we see here. So they might do agricultural work or unskilled manual labor. And some objectors refused to do any work that might support the war at all. Around 6,000 men from that last group were imprisoned under very harsh conditions. So they were forced to perform hard labor, they were malnourished, and they had to live under a rule of silence where they were forbidden to speak to one another. What we see here are conscientious objectors at the Dice Quarry, where they were made to break rocks, and you can see the rocks in the background of the photograph. The stigma of having been a conscientious objector will follow these men long after the Great War itself. So if they were imprisoned, as these men were, they were not released until at least 6 months after the war was over, with the idea that soldiers should have a head start in looking for jobs. Conscientious objectors were also not allowed to vote until 1926. Now, conscientious objectors were often mocked in the press. This is a particularly pointed caricature of the conscientious objector. It's called "This Little Pig Stayed at Home." And here we see the lazy Conchi, who I think is pictured here as being quite wealthy and quite aristocratic looking. And he is lounging in an armchair lazily, while all the other members of his family serve the nation, including his mother and his sister. So this is one media stereotype of the Conchi. He has placed himself as far away from the battlefield as possible. And he has done this not for his pacifist principles, but for his own indulgence and selfishness. Now, this image is very far from the truth, because almost no conscientious objectors were exempted from service altogether. So there were no COs who stayed at home in the sense that they're being pictured here. If you refused to do any kind of service, you were imprisoned. But the objectors who did serve in the military were also mocked and satirized in different ways. I want to show you 2 images from a series called The Conscientious Objector at the Front. So these are images that were put out as postcards in 1916. So here, the Conchi is striking this exaggerated, effeminate pose. And he's saying, "Oh, you naughty, unkind German, really, if you don't desist, I'll forget I've got a conscience and I'll smack you on the wrist. And in this one, the Conchi is pictured as being even more unmanly. So they're actually dressed in women's aprons here, and they are bringing that domestic labor of the home into the trench. So the proximity of the Conchi to the trench is imagined here only as being inappropriate. And the caption is, while the shot and shell are flying and the mighty cannons boom, he is tidying up the trenches with a dustpan and a broom. We can see in these postcards the insistence on the trench soldier as the only possibility for male service. There is no other way to serve one's country as a man. And that is the message of this image. I just want to counter these images with a photograph of real conscientious objectors, because they were often assigned to areas of extreme danger at the front. So these particular conscientious objectors are working as stretcher bearers. And I think it's very difficult to conceive of them as being non-combatants when we see how close they are to the front line. So some of the men who are imagined as the most cowardly civilians, the little pigs who stayed at home, they in fact were often in and around the trenches. Women were also at the front as nurses, as doctors, as ambulance drivers. And probably the best known of the women's organizations is the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or VAD. So these are mostly middle-class women who have very little practical nursing training. And they are used to supplement the Army nurses in British hospitals, but they are also deployed to France and to the Mediterranean. Now, the VADs were often resented by professional nurses because most VADs, as one of them freely admitted, came to the hospital expecting to hold the patient's hands and smooth their pillows, while the regular nurses fetched and carried everything that looked or smelt disagreeable. But their work was, in fact, very demanding. Women will also serve in the armed forces. So the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the WAC, was created in 1917. It was created by some of Britain's leading feminists. And here we see the recruitment poster. Here we see WACs lining up for their paycheck. They served also mostly in France, but sometimes in Belgium, in Greece, and in Italy. And they worked primarily as drivers and cooks and mechanics, sometimes also as support staff. 57,000 British women joined the WAC. And then there are the Wrens, the women of the Royal Naval Service. So this is their recruitment poster, and here they are drilling. And the women of the Royal Air Force. Now, women are working not only at the front, but women are also working to supply the front. And this is a really interesting shift that takes place over the course of the war, that women come to dominate the arms industry. By 1915, 3 times as many women worked in munitions as men. And by the end of the Great War, women were making 80% of all the arms produced in Britain. These women were called munitionettes, and they are mostly working-class women who have left domestic service, many of them never to return. This is a very sporty image, I think, of a woman doing her bit, a munitionette. So she is putting on her smock to make munitions, while her male counterpart, the soldier, marches out the door. This poster is from 1917. This is a very visible reversal, where women become central to the economy and men become peripheral. The soldier is literally on the margins of this poster. It is harder to get into munitions work than it is to get into the Army. So you have to have a much more rigorous health examination to be a munitionette. You have to have perfect eyesight, for example. You have to supply 4 different character references. And you have to be British-born of British parents. This is extremely dangerous work. So there are many different factory explosions. This is a munitions factory in Nottinghamshire that killed 134 people when it blew up. Munitions work took an enormous toll on women's health. These women were also called canary girls because their faces would turn yellow from the chemicals they were using in the munitions factories. And sometimes their hair would also turn green. Mrs. Hall was a munitions worker in London, and she is talking about that experience of having her body transformed by her work as a munitionette. Our skin was perfectly yellow, right down through the body, legs and toenails even, perfectly yellow. In some people, it caused a rash, and a very nasty rash around the chin. It was a shame because we were a bevy of beauties, you know. It was quite a 12-month after we left the factory that the whole of the yellow came from our bodies. This is one of my favorite photographs. So these are the women munitions workers of Bedfordshire. They're about 30 miles north of London. And you can see they are standing underneath that poster that I showed you towards the beginning, Step Into Your Place. And they are staging and reenacting that poster. And they are showing how they too are stepping into their place, just like the soldiers. Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy was an Anglican priest who worked for the Army. He worked in the trenches during the Great War. And what he said about English munitions, seeing it do its work in the trenches, was this: "By George, it's a glorious barrage, and English girls made 'em. We're all in it, sweethearts, mothers, and wives. The hand that rocks the cradle wrecks the world. There are no non-combatants." So this typology of the home front as the world of women and the battlefront as the world of men, and men who are only trench soldiers, this is not accurate. But this is a very common motif of post-war writing, which is that civilians got the war wrong. Civilians, and especially women, have failed to understand the soldier's experience. So where does that hostility come from? To understand this better, I want to go back to that wartime propaganda, and specifically to the later phase of recruitment posters. This is a very famous recruitment poster, and it's one that reflects very explicitly on the relationship between home fronts and battlefronts. The poster is called "Daddy, What Did You Do During the Great War?" It's printed in 1915. But it takes place in an imagined future where the little girl sits with her father with her history book open in her lap, asking him what he did to serve his country. And we can see the son is on the floor playing with his toy soldiers as the father looks off with this troubled expression on his face. So this is the question posed to British men by the end of 1915. What will you tell your daughter in the future if you don't go to war now? The last recruitment poster that I'll show you tonight is also from 1915. "Women of Britain Say Go." And here we see these self-sacrificing British women exhorting their men, exhorting their husbands and sons to go off to battle. This is an image of womanhood wholeheartedly approving the war. Women willingly sacrificing their fathers and their sons and their husbands for the good of the nation. Now, during the war itself, this is mostly seen as a positive image. This is something women can do and should do to participate in the war effort. They can urge men to sign up. Because women don't yet have the vote in Britain. So this is one way for women to express their political affiliations and affections and express their patriotism. But after the war is over, this kind of image becomes a source of resentment. Veterans have the sense that it was the blindness and the mistaken ideals of civilians that have been so deeply destructive. Images like these succeed in marking a break that never actually existed. It is a break between an imagined world of male combatants and an imagined world of women who support the war but are kept entirely safe and distant from it. Timing is everything. And it is shortly after both of these posters are printed, January of 1916, that the Military Service Act introduces conscription, compulsory military service for all single British men ages 18 to 41. In May of 1916, married men will be called up too. This is precisely what Britain had prided itself on avoiding. Even as all the other European nations introduced conscription, Britain had thought of its volunteer army as what made it different. No more. Rather than thinking of home fronts and battlefronts as one of the realities of the Great War that historians should continue to reinforce, we might think instead of the state's increasingly desperate demands of recruitment that drove this image. As states began to recognize that even those huge numbers of volunteers would not be enough, the British state had to create new divisions and new myths about what men were fighting to defend. And it's at that point that the idea of home fronts and battlefronts as two segregated spheres becomes officially entrenched, not as a reflection of experience, but as a way to sell conscription. It may be that the greatest success of the recruitment posters I showed you is not in convincing men to fight, but in creating a mythology of home front and battlefront that has proved remarkably durable, despite its many flaws and its many blind spots. As Jack Mudd's, I think, very moving letter to his wife suggests, ordinary people had more complicated ways to make sense of their experience. It was an experience that included vast numbers of unenlisted men at home, conscientious and otherwise, medical personnel who moved between multiple fronts of the war, and people in England who found themselves not in a protected bubble, but bombed from the sea and the sky. If the state invested its resources in urging people to look back at the war in these constrained terms of home fronts and battlefronts, then we need not and should not accept those terms ourselves. Thank you.
Very good. That brings us there. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So we now have time for questions and answers. I want to begin, in fact, the question and answer session while those questions are being collected. Thank Professor Bailkin for that fine lecture, that thoughtful lecture. And I want to begin with a question of my own. And that question being, if you took your story and shifted it to, say, Germany, how would the story change, or would it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there is certainly a powerful story to be told about the relationship between home fronts and battlefronts in Germany. I think it's a much more contentious and oppositional relationship. And one reason for that is because there are much more severe shortages that civilians undergo in Germany as opposed to Britain. Britain introduces food rationing in 1917, but Germany has been contending with a much more severe food shortage. Britain has instituted a naval blockade of Germany, and that has really thrown Germany back on its own domestic resources for food. So the average price, the average food bill for the German worker has jumped 400% during the war. And another factor that really makes the situation dire for German civilians is that there is a fungus that destroys most of the potato crop of Germany towards the end of 1916 and into 1917. So the winter of 1917 in Germany was known as the turnip winter because there were really very few potatoes, and the civilians had to live primarily on turnips, which is not fun, but it's also very dangerous physically. So you can have severe malnutrition from that kind of experience. And so for that reason, I think civilians in Germany are suffering tremendously, even in relation to the sufferings of British civilians that I talked about tonight. And this is something that when Hitler came to power, he was very concerned to avoid in the next war. So he really felt that part of what had gone wrong for Germany in the Great War was that civilians had turned against the war because of their own food shortages. So one of the reasons he was so intent on kind of creating wealth for Germany in his war was that he wanted to make sure that kind of gap and opposition between home front and battlefront wouldn't exist in the 1930s and 40s.
Here's a question that asks you to take one of your themes and shift it into the post-war period. How did class differences among soldiers who fought in the war, how was that reflected? Because you talked early on in your lecture about social differences in volunteering and the volunteer stage of the war. How does that story move into the post-war period?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Well, one of the ways in which the fantasy of those recruitment posters to a certain extent becomes a reality is that what we see after 1918 is the very beginnings of the welfare state in Britain. So some of the first provisions that are made for all soldiers of whatever class when they return home in 1918 is a new set of welfare provisions for disabled soldiers. So I think the war brings a new awareness. The South African War had sort of begun this process, but the Great War even accelerates it, that to create a better race of soldiers, you need better child welfare and better provision of food and education at all stages of the future soldier's life. So there are certain kinds of provisions put in place for medical care, for subsidized meals in schools after 1918 that will in some sense make Britons more equal and inaugurate a process that will then accelerate after the Second World War in 1945. So some of those kind of early welfare provisions are put in place in 1918.
Okay. Here's a question that relates to the question of nationality within Britain. So what happened to people in Britain of German descent who found themselves, or who were British citizens, who found themselves in Britain during the war?
Yeah, that is a sad story. So 30,000 Germans in Britain were interned during the Great War, and they were put in different kinds of camps, which vary tremendously in terms of the level of hardship or privilege that people in them might experience. So they were mostly disused factories. Some Germans were put in a disused skating rink. Some of them were put in stables. So some of them were very uncomfortable places. Others were sort of holiday camps that were not being used, and then the Army would just throw up some barbed wire kind of around the perimeter of the camp. So there was quite a range of experience for those internees. And they actually really developed a very sophisticated educational culture within those camps. So they developed, because many of the people interned were intellectuals, writers, professors. And so they started what they called people's universities within those camps. And they had very elaborate newspapers and journals that they would put out, paintings, some of which are displayed today in the Imperial War Museum in London. So there were some artifacts of culture that were produced by these camps, but the people who were interned in them spent the duration of the war in them. And that's, again, a process that would be echoed and expanded during the Second World Wars of interning Germans and Italians.
So here's a question that goes to your discussion of everyday life in the trenches. Do we know anything about the delivery of mail? The question is, how did the post office deliver mail to soldiers in the trenches? Do we know anything about that?
I'm sure someone does, and someone's probably written a book on that. I don't know too much more about it than I said. I mean, some of the women that I talked about did work as postal carriers at the front, so they would have been involved in that process. So some of the women secretarial staff were involved in conveying letters and packages from England. But I don't know too much more about the mechanics of the postal service there.
If I can intrude here,
Sure.
Because I wanted, so what happened to women who found their way into labor or jobs that were gendered as masculine in the post-war period? So the munitionettes, for example, what was their experience?
So their experience was mostly that they were very resented by men who came back from the war. Many of them did lose their jobs, but I think part of what happened also was a shift away from the labor they had been doing before the war. So I talked about domestic service, right? And of course, some of us have seen this happen in our beloved Downton Abbey, right? This process whereby when women left their jobs in domestic service and went into various kinds of war work, they usually did not return. So part of what we're seeing is not just a shift in male-female labor, but also in the disappearance of certain kinds of labor that existed before the war. It just kind of goes away altogether. But it's a tremendous shock for men when they come back from the war, because they find women doing jobs that they never would have done before, and in many different kinds of uniform. I mean, women, tram conductors and ticket collectors and jobs like that. So most of those women do go into factory work, I would say, the munitionettes. They don't go back to domestic service. They were always paid less than men munitions workers, so they tend to then find factory work that's at similar rates of pay to the munitions work. It's still usually a big improvement over what they earned in domestic service.
Okay, so you mentioned Downton Abbey, and you anticipated the next question because
Can't help myself.
because it asks, does Downton Abbey do justice in its portrayal of wartime Britain?
Downton Abbey does justice to everything, in my view. I think. Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are things that Downton Abbey really gets right. But one thing that's an interesting choice on Julian Fellowes' part is that he starts the war at the Battle of the Somme, right? So in 1916. So the whole first 2 years of the war for Britain are kind of lost and collapsed in his retelling of it. And I think that's an interesting choice on his part. And it means that certain aspects of the war that I talked about this evening don't really get explored. They're not really part of his story. I think he is very interested, obviously, in the way that the war transforms dynamics of class and of gender. And I don't think there are any conscientious objectors in Downton Abbey, but obviously Matthew, the main character, is a trench soldier, and then what sticks out in my mind thinking about the trench scene is that Thomas, the kind of nefarious servant, gets himself wounded deliberately in order to get out of the war, and that's yet another sign of Thomas's kind of moral failing, but it's maybe a moment where we're more sympathetic to him than we might be. Not to get us too far into Downton Abbey, but I could go on.
Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question here. This relates to the White Feather campaign. So why did British women participate? What is it, and why do British women participate?
So the white feather is a very long-standing symbol of cowardice within the British Army. There are various cultural references for it. There's a novel called The Four Feathers that was published in 1902 about the Sudan, but it's always been a sign of, saying someone's not brave to hand them a white feather within the military. In 1914, a British admiral starts what he calls the Order of the White Feather, and he encourages mostly young British women to hand out white feathers to any British man who is not in uniform, to shame them. And this becomes an incredibly contentious campaign. I think one of the things that it reveals is that the wounds of this war can be invisible, right? So there are many anecdotes of women going up to men and giving them a white feather, and it turns out that the men have already served, but they're home and they have shell shock, for example, which is not a visible injury. So I think the way that narratives of the post-war period talk about the White Feather campaign is again part of the story of what women got wrong about the war, what civilians kind of failed to understand about the soldiers' injuries and trauma. But it's also about how the war has created new kinds of invisible trauma that no one can possibly understand, that medical science can't make sense of as well. And it's a very embarrassing thing for feminists to look back at after the war, when feminism really wants to reclaim its reputation as having been pacifist. It's one of the kind of markers that there were these very militaristic and jingoistic elements to women's behavior during the war too.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.